Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
History has often been shaped by legislation, some of which have left lasting scars on communities for generations. The 1924 Racial Integrity Act, passed in the Commonwealth of Virginia, stands as one of the most racially destructive laws in American history, an instrument of legal erasure and systemic discrimination. While its primary target was to reinforce the boundaries of white supremacy, its far-reaching effects devastated Black natives, a group that straddled both African and Indigenous ancestry. These individuals, whose identity was shaped by a dual heritage, found themselves caught in a racial classification system that sought to erase their Indigenous identity while reinforcing their status as inferior within a rigid racial hierarchy. The early 20th century was a period of intense racial and cultural reckoning in the United States. Jim Crow laws ensured the segregation and subjugation of Black Americans, while the federal government continued its aggressive campaign of assimilation and disenfranchisement of Native American communities. Within this climate, the Racial Integrity Act was not simply about categorizing individuals. It was about controlling the narrative of racial purity, reinforcing social hierarchies, and denying communities their rightful place in history. Black natives, who had already faced centuries of forced displacement, slavery, and systemic oppression, became one of the most affected groups under this legislation. Understanding the impact of this law requires a deep dive into the socio-political landscape of the time, the motivations behind the legislation, and the lasting consequences it had on the Black native population. This historical analysis seeks to shed light on how this law functioned as an extension of white supremacist policies and how its consequences still resonate today. The early 20th century was marked by a growing obsession with racial purity, particularly among white elites who feared the contamination of their bloodline. The eugenics movement, which gained significant traction during this period, provided a pseudoscientific foundation for these anxieties. Prominent eugenicists such as Dr. Walter Plecker, a key architect of the Racial Integrity Act, believed that the preservation of the white race depended on strict racial categorization and the elimination of racial mixing. Virginia, like much of the South, had a long history of racial categorization dating back to colonial times. The one-drop rule, which classified anyone with even a trace of African ancestry as Black, had already been widely accepted socially, even if it had not yet been formalized into law. However, as Native American tribes sought to assert their sovereignty and Black communities continued to resist segregation, white supremacists sought legal means to reinforce their ideology. The passing of the Racial Integrity Act in 1924 was a calculated effort to codify these racist beliefs. It required that all Virginia citizens register their racial identity at birth and outlawed marriages between whites and non-whites. More importantly, it imposed strict definitions of who could be classified as white and effectively erased any acknowledgement of Indigenous ancestry in people of mixed descent. This legislative maneuver had devastating consequences for Black natives, many of whom had long embraced both their African and Indigenous heritage. One of the most insidious aspects of the Racial Integrity Act was its role in erasing Black native identity. Under this law, individuals of mixed African and Native ancestry were forcibly categorized as Black, with no legal recognition of their Indigenous roots. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate effort to rewrite history and further the eugenicist goal of white racial purity. Many Native American tribes in Virginia, particularly the Powhatan, Monacan, and Pamunkey, had intermarried with African Americans over generations. This blending of cultures and bloodlines had created a rich and unique identity that was integral to these communities. However, under the Racial Integrity Act, their Indigenous identity was effectively erased. Those who attempted to claim Native status were often met with resistance from both state officials and white-controlled institutions that sought to diminish their presence. Dr. Walter Plecker, as Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics, played a particularly aggressive role in enforcing the law. He routinely altered birth and marriage records to classify all individuals of mixed ancestry as colored, effectively erasing generations of Native Americans from official recognition. His zealotry extended to sending threatening letters to families who attempted to assert their indigenous heritage, warning them of the legal repercussions of claiming anything other than a black identity. The consequences of this erasure were profound. Many black natives lost their tribal affiliations, were denied access to indigenous lands and resources, and faced systemic discrimination from both black and native communities. Without legal recognition, many were unable to benefit from federal programs designed to support Native Americans, further marginalizing an already vulnerable population. Beyond the immediate impact on identity, the Racial Integrity Act reinforced a racial caste system that dictated social mobility and civil rights. Black natives, like African Americans, were subjected to the full force of Jim Crow segregation. They were denied access to white-only spaces, excluded from political representation, and subjected to economic discrimination. For black natives who had maintained strong ties to their indigenous heritage, this law created a deep cultural and psychological crisis. Being forcibly categorized as black in a society that devalued blackness meant facing intensified racial prejudice. Simultaneously, their connection to native traditions was severed by a state apparatus that refused to acknowledge their history. This dual exclusion left many black natives in a precarious position, struggling to navigate a society that sought to erase them at every turn. Even after the Supreme Court invalidated laws banning interracial marriage in Loving v. Virginia, 1967, and the Civil Rights Movement brought legislative victories, the damage of the Racial Integrity Act persisted. Many families found it difficult to reclaim their native heritage due to decades of legal erasure. The destruction of records, the forced assimilation, and the racial reclassification made it nearly impossible for many to prove their indigenous ancestry. The 1924 Racial Integrity Act was more than a law. It was a weapon of systemic oppression designed to uphold white supremacy and erase the identities of those who did not fit into its rigid racial classifications. For black natives, the effects of this legislation were particularly devastating, stripping them of their indigenous identity while subjecting them to the full force of anti-black racism. Even as legal barriers have been lifted, the legacy of this act lingers. Many black native communities continue to fight for recognition, seeking to reclaim the history and identity that was stolen from them nearly a century ago. The fight for historical justice remains ongoing, as descendants work to restore the dignity and acknowledgement that their ancestors were denied. History has a long memory, and while laws can be repealed, their consequences endure. The story of the Racial Integrity Act serves as a cautionary tale about the power of the state to shape identities and the resilience of communities who refuse to be erased.